It's weird, right? We think about being rational, and we picture pure logic, cold, hard facts. But sometimes, the stuff that really gets us thinking outside the box, it's not always so straightforward.
It's true. We tend to think more data, more complexity, that's got to be the key to better decisions. But human rationality, it's not just about limitless processing power, is it?
Right, like take that serial killer example from the lecture.
Oh yeah, that's a classic illustration of what happens when we bump up against the limits of bounded rationality. We only have so much time, so much information to work with in the real world.
And sometimes, a simpler approach can actually be more accurate.
Exactly. The centroid method, for instance. You wouldn't think that just finding the central point of a bunch of crime locations would be so effective.
Compared to some super complicated probability model.
The lecture pointed out, especially when you've got limited data points, like less than 9 crimes in that example, that simple centroid method, it can actually be more on target. It really makes you question those assumptions we have about what's rational.
Totally. That ties into another concept that blew my mind, the underdetermination problem. Basically saying there's an infinite number of explanations that could fit any set of data.
It's a bit unsettling when you first encounter it, isn't it? Because it means logic alone can't be the only thing guiding us to the truth.
So then how are we supposed to choose what to believe? If logic isn't enough, what else is there?
That's where those non-logical criteria come in. And that's probably a lot more of our decision-making than we'd like to admit sometimes.
We've got to have some kind of criteria, right? Like Occam's razor, the idea that the simplest explanation is usually the best bet.
Sure, Occam's razor is a good starting point. But even then, it's not always so simple, is it? That's when we run into the bias-variance dilemma, trying to find that sweet spot between oversimplifying and overcomplicating things.
Okay, I can see how that gets tricky. Hit me with the analogy. I always learn best with a good analogy.
Imagine you're trying to understand musical tastes. You ask your 5 closest friends what kind of music they like, and they all say jazz. So you walk away thinking everyone loves jazz.
I see where you're going with this.
Right.
That's the bias part, right? You're only looking at a super small, probably biased sample size.
Exactly. That's underfitting, making your model of the world too simple. But on the flip side, let's say you randomly meet 2 left-handed people at a coffee shop, and they both happen to love classical music. You could develop a theory that all left-handed people prefer classical.
Right, but that's just a random correlation, not some big truth about left-handedness in music.
That's the danger of overfitting, seeing patterns where they don't actually exist just because you're latching onto a small set of data.
So we're stuck between a rock and a hard place then. Underfitting, we miss the bigger picture. Overfitting, and we're chasing shadows. How do we find that balance?
It's a challenge that AI researchers are tackling head-on. They're using what they call disruptive strategies to help AI systems avoid that overfitting trap.
Disruptive strategies. That sounds kind of counterintuitive. Wouldn't that make things more chaotic?
One technique is called dropout, where they basically just randomly shut off different parts of a neural network while it's learning. Another is actually introducing random noise into the system.
Sounds crazy, right?
I guess the idea is to shake things up, right? To keep the AI from getting stuck in a rut.
Exactly. By disrupting those rigid patterns, they help the AI explore a wider range of possibilities, which leads to better learning and adaptation.
So it's like giving the AI a little nudge in a different direction every now and then. Kind of like, hey, don't get too comfy with that solution. There might be a better way.
And the funny thing is, we as humans, we do this kind of stuff too, don't we? Think about those times you're wrestling with a tough problem. You've been laser focused, but you just can't seem to crack the code.
Ugh, tell me about it. And then you finally step away, maybe take a walk, do something completely unrelated, and bam, the answer just pops into your head right out of the blue.
That's that mind wandering at play. And it's not just anecdotal. There's research suggesting that giving your conscious mind a break can actually pave the way for those aha moments.
It's like our brains need that space to make those unexpected connections, those leaps of intuition that we wouldn't have stumbled upon otherwise. It reminds me of another area where we sort of embrace this controlled chaos.
Yeah. Dreams, psychedelics even. These are areas where the lecture really starts to push the boundaries of conventional thinking about rationality.
How can these experiences, which often feel so random, chaotic, actually have any connection to making rational decisions?
It's a fascinating question. One theory is that these states act as a sort of reset button for our brains, disrupting those deeply ingrained thought patterns that might be keeping us stuck in a rut.
So it's like by temporarily shaking up the snow globe of our minds, we create the potential for new patterns to emerge, new connections that we might not have seen otherwise.
Precisely. It's not just some modern, new agey idea either. Cultures throughout history, they've had their own versions of this.
Like those intense Mayan rituals, the fasting, the bloodletting, even the use of hallucinogenic substances. Those seem a million miles away from sitting down and calmly calculating the pros and cons of a decision.
Totally. The lecture makes this really interesting connection, suggesting that these rituals might actually serve a similar purpose to those disruptive strategies we see in AI. By pushing people outside their comfort zones, by disrupting their ordinary states of consciousness, it's like they were creating the conditions for new insights to bubble up.
Sometimes the most rational thing we can do is to let go of that need for control, that obsession with logic, and just allow ourselves to be a little bit uncomfortable, a little bit disrupted even.
Absolutely. That brings us to a crucial point about how we deal with the unknown, how we make decisions when we don't have all the answers, which is most of the time in the real world.
And that's where the distinction between risk and uncertainty comes into play, right? There's actually a pretty important difference.
There is. It's a subtle but crucial distinction. So risk is when you're dealing with a situation where you know the probabilities involved, even if the outcome itself is uncertain. Like flipping a coin, you know it's a 50-50 chance.
You're saying risk is like, I know the odds, but I don't know what's going to happen on any given toss.
Uncertainty is when you don't even know the possible outcomes, let alone the probabilities. It's the unknowns, those curveballs life throws at you that you could never have predicted.
It's like that old Mike Tyson quote, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face.
Exactly. And the lecture points out that the real world, it's overflowing with uncertainty. The systems are complex, things are constantly changing.
It makes me realize how much time I've wasted trying to analyze every single possibility before making a decision.
We can't predict everything. So we need a different kind of rationality, one that's less about trying to control every outcome and more about being adaptable, being able to roll with the punches.
So how do we cultivate that kind of adaptable rationality? Do we need to become Zen masters or something?
The lecture does offer a helpful framework for thinking about this idea of small worlds versus large worlds.
Small worlds, large worlds. Okay, break it down.
A small world is a situation that's well-defined, where the rules are clear, and you can predict the outcomes, like a game of chess.
So then a large world would be more like life, right?
Yeah.
Where there are so many variables, so many things outside of our control.
The lecture uses the example of taking good notes during a lecture. You can go in with a plan, maybe even a fancy new note-taking system.
But then the professor goes on a tangent or the fire alarm goes off or you spill coffee all over your notebook.
Real life rarely follows the script. And that's why we need different tools for navigating those large world problems.
So if the challenge in those large world scenarios isn't finding the right answer, what is it? What are we aiming for instead?
It's about asking the right questions. The biggest challenge often lies in framing the problem effectively and figuring out what really matters in a given situation.
So instead of getting bogged down and trying to analyze every single detail, it's more about zooming out and asking ourselves, what am I even trying to accomplish here?
Exactly. And that's where that concept of abduction comes in. It's that less formal way of reasoning, that ability to make sense of messy, complex situations, to see patterns where others might not.
So it's that ability to look at all the pieces of the puzzle, even the ones that don't seem to fit, and find a way to make sense of it all.
Precisely. This ties into another fascinating concept. The lecture explores this idea of serious play. It might sound counterintuitive, but the idea is that we can use playful exploration, even pretend, to help us navigate complex real-life situations.
Give me an example. How does that work in practice?
Think about couples who choose to travel together before making a long-term commitment.
The trial by travel test.
They're engaging in a serious play, testing compatibility, seeing how well they navigate challenges together in a new environment.
Or what about people who get a dog to practice for having kids? We see that all the time.
They're essentially running a real-world simulation, gathering data on their patients, their ability to adapt, to adjust their routines, all of which are essential skills for parenting.
So by engaging in these forms of serious play, we're building those muscles of adaptability and resilience, preparing ourselves for the inevitable curveballs that life is going to throw our way.
Speaking of serious play, the lecture dives into fascinating examples of how this concept shows up in everything from ancient rituals to modern role-playing games.
Oh yeah, what was that Nordic role-playing game called again? Jeep form, right? I was fascinated by that whole concept.
It's designed to explore really complex emotional situations, blurring that line between the game and real life.
Less about slaying dragons and more about developing emotional intelligence, empathy, that kind of thing.
They talk about bleed, how the insights and emotions from the game can actually spill over into your real life and vice versa.
It makes you realize that sometimes stepping outside of our comfort zones, embracing those experiences that challenge our perspectives, can be some of the most powerful tools for personal growth and rational decision-making.
And that brings us to another crucial aspect of rationality that often gets overlooked, the role of imagination and aspiration in shaping who we become.
And this is where that idea of proleptic rationality comes into play, right?
Yeah.
Making decisions in the present that are in alignment with the best version of our future selves.
It's that forward-thinking aspect of rationality, recognizing that we're not just reacting to the present, but we're actively shaping our future selves through the choices we make today.
It's like having that vision, that sense of possibility, and then allowing that to guide our actions in the present moment.
And that ties beautifully with this whole theme we've been exploring, this idea that uncertainty and change, they're not the enemies of rationality.
Right, they're not things to be feared or avoided.
Embraced. Because within that willingness to lean into the unknown, that's where we often find the most profound opportunities for growth and transformation.
So I've got imagination playing this crucial role in our decision-making, influencing who we might become. Where do rituals fit into all of this? It seems like we often think of rituals as rigid traditions, things people do almost on autopilot without really thinking about them.
Yeah, it's easy to see them that way, as these empty gestures. But the lecture, it offers this intriguing alternative view that rituals, when we engage with them intentionally, they can actually become powerful catalysts for change.
I'm definitely hooked on this idea of ritual as transformation, but how does that actually play out in real life? Give me an example.
Well, think about something like learning Tai Chi. It's not just a form of exercise, is it? It's a practice that cultivates awareness, discipline. There's that mind-body connection that goes way beyond just going through the motions.
That's where the imaginal comes in again, right?
Yeah.
The lecture talks about how those initial movements in Tai Chi, imagining your feet sinking into mud, your arms flowing like water, it's like you're using your imagination to reprogram your body, to move in a whole new way.
It highlights how even simple rituals can have this ripple effect, influencing how we perceive ourselves, how we interact with the world around us.
By changing how we move, how we hold ourselves, we're actually changing how we feel, how we think.
And that's really the heart of it, isn't it? That feedback loop between mind and body, action and perception. The lecture suggests that this kind of serious play, this engagement with the imaginal, it's not just some frivolous add-on to rationality. It's actually fundamental to what it means to be truly rational.
It's about cultivating wisdom, about self-awareness, about that constant dance between adapting to the world as it is and shaping ourselves into who we want to become.
Absolutely, because the world throws us curveballs, right? We can plan all we want, but eventually we're all going to get punched in the face. It's that ability to adapt, to learn from those experiences that really determines how well we navigate the complexities of life.
Rationality isn't about having all the answers. It's about cultivating that flexibility, that resilience that allows us to keep going even when we get knocked down.
It's about embracing uncertainty, recognizing that change is inevitable, and finding ways to grow and evolve along the way.
Wow. This deep dive has been quite a journey. We started out thinking about rationality as this very logical, linear thing, but it turns out it's so much messier and more fascinating than that.
It really is, and it's interconnected with our creativity, our emotions, even our physical bodies in ways that we probably don't even realize.
Maybe a good takeaway for our listeners is to think about those different forms of serious play in their own lives. Whether it's exploring a creative practice, engaging in a meaningful ritual, or even just taking the time to connect with their imaginations in a more intentional way.
Because ultimately, it's about recognizing that rationality isn't just about thinking our way through life. It's about experiencing it fully, embracing all of its complexities, and using those experiences as fuel for growth and transformation.
It's time to wrap up this deep dive into the world of rationality. It's been a thought-provoking journey, to say the least. Until next time, keep those minds open, keep those imaginations fired up, and remember, the most interesting discoveries are often the ones we least expect.